Hello, this is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc, and this is a short video on wheel grade, or how hard is your wheel. And there's a little bit of misconception there because people will say, hey man, I was getting a loss of form when I was grinding, and my wheel supplier gave me a harder wheel. If it's an aluminum oxide wheel, the hardness of aluminum oxide is 2100 newtons per, let's say 2100 newt, and it has been for the past 18 billion years when the first 13.5 billion years when the first aluminum oxide molecule was created. We're not going to change it. What wheel grade has to do with is how much, with one caveat, how much bond material is there holding the grid in place. Okay? And I will talk about the caveat when we're done. Let's say we have an H grade wheel. An H grade wheel is considered soft. What that means is there's just not a lot of bond material holding the guy in place. The H grade wheel is there, you dress him and you start to grind. You start to grind your steel work piece, and that guy starts to become dull and flat. And then the grit says to the bond material, hey man, I'm just dull and flat. All I'm doing is rubbing, I'm generating a lot of heat. Can I go home? And the bond material, there's not a lot of it, says, all right, okay, you can go home. And he liberates the dull grit. The grit breaks out of the bond material. Okay, that's an H wheel, a soft wheel. Now let's go a little bit harder. HIJ. So a J wheel now has more bond material holding him in place. So he's got more bond. So now the grit starts grinding. He becomes dull. And the grit says to the bond material, he says, hey man, can I go home? All I'm doing is just rubbing and generating heat. And the bond material says, no man, you got to stay and continue to work. So he continues to grind, he rubs a lot, maybe occasionally forms a chip, but he rubs a lot. He generates a lot of heat. He generates a lot bigger normal forces, which cause deflection and chatter and other unpleasant things. But he is continuing to be in the action. Then the grit in our J grade, medium grade wheel says, hey man, says to the bond material, can I go home? And the bond material says, okay, okay. And he lets him bust out of the bond material. Okay. But now we have not an HIJ, not a K, not an L, let's say an M or an N grade wheel. Now there's a lot of bond material holding that grid in place. So now we're grinding. The guy becomes dull. He's rubbing more. He's generating more heat. And the grit says to the bond material, hey man, can I go home? And the bond material says, no way, man, you're staying here because there's so much bond material holding him in place. He's just not going to let him go. So he grinds some more. He becomes duller and duller and flatter and flatter. And then the grit says to the bond material, hey, man, can I go home? And there's so much bond material holding him in place. The bond material says, no, man, you're staying here. I'm not going to let you go. He grinds some more. Now he's super, super dull, and big forces on the grits, a lot of heat generation, big force pushing up on the spindle, lots of deflection, taper, chatter, form holding issues, everything else. And then the grit says to the bond material, hey man, can I go home? And the bond material says, no man, because there's so much bond material in the NMN wheel. And the guy's becoming duller and duller, and finally the grit says, hey, can I please go home? All I'm doing is generating a lot of heat. The forces are big on the guy. And eventually the bond material says, okay, and he breaks out of the bond material. Okay. Now these conversations don't actually occur. This is for pedagogical, educational purposes. Okay. They don't actually occur. It's just for education. It's just to give an analogy, a metaphor. Okay. Now, not all hardness of wheels depends on how much grit or how much bond. Sometimes wheel manufacturers will not just say we're going to put in more bond, we'll put in stronger bond. So then it gets a little complicated because the formula you'll see in a lot of the textbooks will say they add in more bond, and they do that a lot, or they add in a stronger bond, or they do a bit of both, and then different bond formulations have different designations, so it gets complicated. But in general, a hard wheel, a high grade, not HIJK, but LMNOP, those have a lot of bond material or strong bond material, and they just hold the grid in place longer. They are better form holding, but they generate a lot more heat. The basics of grinding, there it is. This is Jeff Badger, the Grinding Doc. To learn more, take my 3-day high-intensity grinding course, get a copy of the 4,000-page Book of Grinding to learn more about grinding.